What if the men who built America weren't saints or symbols, but flawed, frightened, and dangerously human? We've carved their faces into mountains and printed them on our money, turning them into marble gods. But behind the portraits and the myths were men who bled, argued, failed, and feared the same way we do. The difference is that history decided to remember only their victories. The rest, the doubt, the compromise, the betrayal, was left on the cutting room floor of the American story. The legend begins cleanly, as all legends do: powdered wigs, ink-stained quills, and noble declarations about liberty. The images are cinematic: Jefferson writing by candlelight, Washington crossing the Delaware, Franklin charming salons in Paris. But these are postcards, not people. The truth smelled less like destiny and more like sweat, tobacco, and fear. The revolution was not a chorus of harmony. It was a chorus of argument, panic, and desperation held together by paper and pride. In private letters, the Founding Fathers admitted what public speeches never could. They doubted themselves. They feared the mob as much as the monarchy. They argued over taxes, religion, slavery, and power, and sometimes they hated one another. Jefferson called Hamilton a monarchist in disguise. Hamilton called Jefferson a hypocrite wrapped in philosophy. Adams called everyone dangerous, including himself. The birth of liberty was not a sermon. It was a knife fight in a locked room. Even Washington, the most untouchable of them all, carried shadows he rarely showed. He didn't crave power, he feared it. The weight of command nearly broke him more than once. His soldiers mutinied. His teeth ached constantly. He lost more battles than he won. But his silence, that iron control over temper and emotion, became the myth of leadership America needed. The truth was lonelier. He was a man holding together a nation that could collapse with one wrong word. And yet, from this chaos, something extraordinary emerged. They created a republic not because they were flawless, but because they understood how fragile freedom really was. They knew power corrupts because they felt it burning in their own hands. They wrote checks and balances not for idealism, but for protection against kings, against mobs, and perhaps most of all, against themselves. We were never meant to worship them. We were meant to learn from them, to see how wisdom can coexist with hypocrisy, and how courage often walks beside fear. But as generations passed, the edges softened. The men became monuments. Their contradictions were erased, and in their place we built an easier story, one that flatters us more than it teaches us. They were not demigods. They were architects of uncertainty, sketching a blueprint for something no one had ever tried before. And maybe that's the real miracle, that a group of flawed men, divided by ego and fear, built a system strong enough to outlast even them. By the early 1770s, the 13 colonies were tinderboxes waiting for a spark. The air smelled of wood smoke and gunpowder dreams. Taverns buzzed louder than churches, and newspapers dripped with words sharper than bayonets. Pamphlets and rumours spread faster than the king's soldiers could ride whispers of liberty, of rebellion, of a world that no longer belonged to the crown. On one side stood loyalty, old and trembling. On the other, defiance, young and reckless. Between them lay the Atlantic and the question of who truly owned the future. Boston was the heartbeat of the unrest, pounding with anger beneath the boots of redcoats, the smell of salt and tar from the harbour, mixed with the sour stink of resentment. Meetings spilled into streets, voices rising in candlelit rooms thick with tobacco and defiance. Across town, the British officers laughed in polished taverns, their scarlet coats glowing under the lanterns, bright, confident, outnumbered. The empire was everywhere and yet already slipping away. In Philadelphia, the mood was different, quieter, but no less dangerous. The city of merchants and thinkers hummed with debate. Printers worked through the night, presses clattering out essays that questioned everything: loyalty, law, and divine right. The colonies were learning to think for themselves, and thinking, it turned out, was contagious. Men like Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson wrote as if words could cut chains, and they were beginning to. Still, the colonies were far from united. Many feared rebellion as much as tyranny. Farmers wanted peace. Merchants wanted trade. Slaves, women, and indigenous nations heard the word freedom, echoing through halls they were never allowed to enter. The dream of independence was not yet pure. It was a tangle of ideals and interests, of hope stitched to hypocrisy. The birth of liberty came with contractions of contradiction. Across the ocean, London watched with weary arrogance. Parliament dismissed the protests as noise, and King George saw the colonies as misbehaving children who would soon remember their place. But America had already changed. The old loyalty had cracked, replaced by a new kind of hunger, not just for independence, but for identity. The colonists weren't simply defying Britain, they were inventing themselves. By 1975, the fire had spread beyond control. Muskets cracked in Lexington, smoke rolled across Concord, and words became bullets. The world had shifted overnight from petitions to revolution, from argument to war. And though no one could see it yet, the men who would become the founding fathers were stepping out of the shadows of empires into the harsh, uncertain light of creation. The age of obedience was over. The age of the experiment had begun. He never wanted the job. When the Continental Congress handed George Washington command of the ragtag army in 1975, he accepted with the gravity of a man walking toward his own gallows. He wore his uniform like armor against fate, but beneath the polished buttons and calm exterior lived a man riddled with doubt. He knew war, its chaos, its waste, its lies, and he feared not defeat, but the temptation of power. "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with," he confessed. Yet he rode out anyway, because someone had to. Washington's soldiers adored and feared him in equal measure. He was tall, almost mythic in silhouette, but his temper was volcanic. Letters describe him cursing the incompetence of officers, smashing his hat against the ground when men deserted or when supplies failed to arrive. He demanded discipline from an army that barely had shoes. And still, when the rage burned out, he walked among the same men, sharing their meager rations, bleeding with them through the snows of Valley Forge. He wasn't gentle, but he was steady, the kind of leader who looked like he belonged to the future, even while drowning in the present. Honor was his obsession, his compass, and his curse. Every decision he made was shadowed by the fear of betrayal, of failure, of being remembered as another Cromwell or Caesar. He refused pay for his command, not out of humility, but to prove to himself that he could hold power without being consumed by it. He understood what few of his peers did, that revolutions devour their heroes. He would not let that happen to him. In private, Washington wrote of sleepless nights, of a stomach knotted with anxiety, of a loneliness so heavy it pressed like armor against his ribs. His correspondence reveals not the certainty of a general, but the exhaustion of a man carrying a nation's fragile dream on his shoulders. The army was starving, Congress was broke, and the cause of liberty looked like madness. Yet, he kept the mask-intact dignity in place of despair. To his men, he was unbreakable. To himself, he was always one failure away from ruin. When victory finally came, it didn't bring relief. It brought fear. The people hailed him as a savior, whispered of crowns, thrones, and new monarchies. He recoiled at the thought. Power was the one enemy he could never fully defeat. When he resigned his command at war's end, his voice trembled with relief and sorrow. He was done being the sword of the revolution. "Having finished the work assigned me," he said, "I retire from the great theatre of action." But the theatre would not let him go. History would remember George Washington as the man who could have been king and chose not to be. But the truth is more haunting. He didn't reject power because he didn't want it. He rejected it because he understood it too well. In the end, his greatest victory wasn't on the battlefield. It was in learning when to step away from the throne that never quite stopped calling his name. Thomas Jefferson believed that words could set men free, yet his own hands were never clean. In the flicker of candlelight at Monticello, he wrote of liberty, reason, and the rights of man. his quill scratching against parchment like a sermon to the future. All men are created equal. He wrote a sentence that would outlive empires. But outside his window, in the damp Virginia night, enslaved men and women worked fields they would never own. Freedom, for Jefferson, was an idea that glowed brightest when it was kept at a distance. He saw himself as a philosopher first, a politician second, and a man of feeling above both. His mind was an engine of contradictions, rational yet romantic, bold yet cautious, idealist yet hypocrite. In one breath, he condemned slavery as moral depravity. In the next, he calculated the profits of it in ledgers written in his precise, elegant hand. He wrote about the dignity of the common man while living off the labor of those who could not speak. He dreamed of equality, but built that dream on a foundation of silence. Jefferson's brilliance was undeniable. He collected knowledge like other men collected coins, languages, science, architecture, philosophy. His house at Monticello was his laboratory, every hallway an experiment in beauty and control. Yet behind its neoclassical symmetry lived the deepest imbalance of all, an Enlightenment thinker chained to a feudal reality. He wrote symphonies of freedom while ignoring the dissonance echoing from the quarters below. In private letters, Jefferson's tone shifts from lofty to human, wistful, melancholic, sometimes broken. He wrote of debts he couldn't pay, of political enemies he couldn't ignore, and of moral debts he dared not name. His relationship with Sally Hemings' enslaved woman, half-sister to his late wife, remains one of history's most uneasy truths. Was it affection? Exploitation? Both? The answer sits in the uneasy silence between his words. As president, Jefferson preached small government and personal liberty, but his hands drew maps of empire, the Louisiana Purchase, the westward expansion that would erase nations and remake a continent. He called America the Empire of Liberty, never admitting that empires, by nature, require someone to be conquered. In his mind, the paradox held. Freedom was destiny. Injustice was inconvenience. When he died on July 4, 1826, the same day as John Adams, Jefferson's last letter still spoke of enlightenment and reason. He never escaped the contradictions he was born into. He simply learned to live among them. His words lit revolutions around the world, even as his own world remained dim with shadows. Thomas Jefferson built a temple to liberty but filled it with ghosts. And maybe that is America's inheritance, a nation forever trying to live up to the promise written by a man who could never quite live by it himself. Benjamin Franklin lived two lives, one that history celebrates, and another it quietly forgets. To the public, he was the wise old sage of the Revolution, the inventor with spectacles, the philosopher of common sense, the printer who became a prophet. But behind that grandfatherly smile was a mind sharper than any blade, a man who moved through the world like a chess player, always 3 moves ahead. He could charm kings, outwit rivals, and sell rebellion with the grace of a salesman. In Europe, they called him the American Socrates. In truth, he was something closer to a magician, a man who knew how to turn ideas into illusions. When Franklin arrived in Paris in the late 1772s, he was 70 years old and dressed like a legend. Plain clothes, fur hat, twinkling eyes that seemed to promise wisdom and mischief at once. France adored him. Aristocrats invited him to salons. Duchesses kept locks of his hair. The philosopher Voltaire kissed him in public, and the crowd erupted as if 2 prophets had met. Franklin understood the theatre of diplomacy, how to turn simplicity into spectacle. While the world saw a kindly philosopher, he was quietly securing loans, weapons, and alliances that would keep the revolution alive. But every performance carries a price. While Franklin drank wine in Versailles and played the role of the Enlightenment sage, his personal life unraveled across the ocean. His loyalist son, William, sat imprisoned by the very rebels his father had helped inspire. The bond between them snapped beyond repair. The revolution that made Franklin immortal also made him a stranger to his own child. He rarely spoke of it, burying grief beneath letters filled with jokes and philosophy. "I never knew a peace that did not cost something," he once wrote. Franklin's genius was not only in invention, but in manipulation. He edited reality the way he edited his newspapers, polishing, omitting, framing. In private correspondence, he mocked British diplomats while flattering them in person. He leaked his own letters to the press to steer public opinion, orchestrating both sides of the conversation. He understood that truth in politics was not a matter of fact, but of timing. To him, the revolution was as much a narrative as a war, and he was its editor-in-chief. Yet beneath the wit and strategy lay exhaustion. Franklin's health was failing. Gout gnawed at his legs, and sleep came in fragments. He wrote of longing for his garden, for quiet, for the smell of Philadelphia after rain. He missed the simplicity of ink and type, the world before crowns and courts. "I sometimes wish I had never left my printing press," he confessed to a friend. But destiny had made him something else, the face of American genius. When he returned home, the crowds cheered, but the man who stepped off the ship was older, lonelier, and more complicated than the myth that greeted him. He had given the revolution its image, but the cost was his peace. Benjamin Franklin mastered the art of appearing unbreakable, and perhaps that was his greatest invention of all. John Adams burned hot. His temper flared as easily as a musket spark, and once ignited, it could scorch everything around him, colleagues, friends, even history itself. He was brilliant, righteous, and impossible. In the Congress of 1976, he thundered through debates like a man possessed, his words crashing against the walls of Philadelphia's Independence Hall. He didn't just argue for revolution, he demanded it, consumed by conviction that freedom was the only cure for tyranny. And yet, behind that fire was a man haunted by loneliness, one whose truest ally lived hundreds of miles away. Abigail Adams was his balance, his conscience, and his equal in every way that mattered. While he wrestled with empires, she held the home front, raising children, managing the farm, and navigating shortages that turned daily life into quiet warfare. Her letters to John were as precise as his speeches were furious. "Remember the ladies," she wrote with both affection and warning. "Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands." He laughed at the time, but the words stayed with him like a splinter under the skin. Their correspondence became a map of the revolution's human side, hundreds of letters, tender and tactical. Abigail was no mere observer. She was strategist, philosopher, and critic. She reminded him to temper passion with principle, to think beyond the moment's victory. "Great necessities call out great virtues," she wrote, when the war dragged on and hope ran thin. When Congress faltered, John read her letters by candlelight and felt steadied again. To him, her pen was both compass and comfort. But even the strongest partnership strained under the weight of history. John's pride often collided with his insecurity. He resented that men like Jefferson charmed, where he argued that Franklin's wit won friends more easily than his honesty. In one of his darker moods, he confessed that the revolution was devouring him. "I am worn out with public life." Abigail replied gently, "Then you must rest when liberty can stand on its own legs." Her calm could cool his temper faster than politics ever could. When Adams became president, the distance between them grew again, not by geography, but by burden. The capital was cruel to idealists. He faced betrayal from allies, mockery from enemies, and silence from the country he'd helped to create. Through it all, Abigail's letters continued thoughtful, firm, always laced with love. She reminded him that greatness was not in glory, but in endurance. "To be good and to do good," she wrote, "is all we have to aim at." They died within hours of each other on July 4th, 1826, as if unwilling to live in a world the other had left. Their marriage was not perfection, it was partnership in its rawest form, flawed, equal, and fiercely loyal. In a revolution built on words, theirs were the ones that lasted, proof that the true strength behind America's independence may have come not from a congress of men, but from the quiet wisdom of one woman's pen. ChatGPT said, "He was born with nothing, no family name, no inheritance, not even a country to call his own. Alexander Hamilton arrived in the world as a storm orphan in the Caribbean, raised among salt air, sugar, and survival. By the time he was 15, he was writing letters so vivid and desperate that readers took up a collection to send him to America. He didn't ask for sympathy. He asked for a chance. From the moment he stepped onto the docks of New York, he knew the only way to outrun obscurity was to write himself into history and never stop. Hamilton's pen was his weapon, his engine, his salvation. While others fought with muskets, he battled with words, essays, manifestos, letters that burned through the paper with precision and fury. He wrote until his hand cramped, until the ink bled through, until no one could ignore the brilliance hidden behind his hunger. George Washington noticed first. The general saw in him a mind that could shape chaos into order. In the tented camps of war, Hamilton became Washington's aide, a young man writing the revolution one letter at a time. But ambition burned hotter than loyalty. Hamilton wanted more than to serve. He wanted to build. When the war ended, he looked at the disunited states, broke, confused, fracturing, and saw not victory, but danger. To him, freedom without structure was anarchy waiting to happen. While others dreamed of liberty, Hamilton dreamed of systems, banks, credit, trade, stability. He saw that a nation was not just an idea, it was an economy. His vision was radical. He argued that America's strength would not come from land or lineage, but from trust, the invisible thread that tied debts to destiny. His plan was to bind the states together with shared obligations, to make their futures inseparable through finance. Critics called him dangerous, even monarchist. Jefferson called him a threat to the Republic. But Hamilton saw further. If money could move across borders, so could unity. The United States would stand or fall on credit, and he would be the architect of both. His enemies hated him because they couldn't match him. His intellect was electric, his temper volcanic. He wrote faster than most men could think, cutting down opponents with paragraphs sharper than any blade. Yet the same fire that built the treasury also consumed him. Scandal followed brilliance. Arrogance shadowed genius. He fought too often, loved too fiercely, and trusted too rarely. But through it all, he kept writing as if afraid the silence would erase him. When he fell in that New Jersey field in 1804, his name was already immortal, though he never lived to see it. His legacy wasn't a statue or a slogan, it was the machinery of a nation. Credit, currency, stability, and the restless idea that ambition could be patriotic. Alexander Hamilton didn't inherit America. He invented it, line by line, ledger by ledger, until the orphan became the architect of the Republic's heartbeat. The summer of 1987 was suffocating in Philadelphia, a city thick with heat, flies, and secrets. Behind the closed doors of the Pennsylvania State House, the air was heavier still. The men gathered there, veterans, lawyers, dreamers, cynics, were supposed to be drafting a future. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a room filled with distrust and fear. The revolution had been won, but the Republic was falling apart. What they were about to create could either save it or destroy it before it began. The Articles of Confederation had failed. The states were 13 quarrelsome siblings, each clutching its own purse and pride. Debts mounted. Militias muttered. Trade collapsed. The dream of independence was rotting from within. So they called for a convention to amend. Though every man in that room knew the truth, they weren't there to fix the old system. They were there to replace it. And if word of that leaked, they'd be branded traitors to their own revolution. The doors were locked, windows sealed, guards posted outside to keep the curious at bay. No minutes were published, no records released. Only silence and sweat filled the chamber. Inside, tempers flared. Gouverneur Morris cursed. Edmund Randolph threatened to leave. Hamilton delivered speeches so long even Madison stopped taking notes. Every issue was a battlefield representation, taxation, slavery, sovereignty. Each delegate saw a different America, and none could agree on what freedom should look like when written down. At the center of it all stood George Washington, presiding in near silence. He said little. but his presence was its own argument, a living symbol of unity, a warning against chaos. The others looked to him as if to a compass, but even he couldn't steady the room forever. When the debate turned to power, who should hold it, how much, and for how long, the air grew thick with suspicion. Every man feared creating another king, even as he feared living without one. The deadlock broke not with triumph, but with exhaustion. Compromise became survival. The small states got their Senate, the large states their House. The South secured protection for slavery. The North secured a government strong enough to tax. No one was satisfied. No one was innocent. When the final draft lay on the table, many hesitated to sign. Franklin, old and weary, looked around the room and said, "I consent to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I am not sure it is not the best." Outside, the city waited for news. Inside, men signed in silence, knowing they had built something fragile, a republic stitched together with arguments, fear, and hope. When it was done, Washington stepped into the sun, pale and solemn. Someone asked Franklin what kind of government they had created. He answered without smiling, "A republic if you can keep it." The miracle of Philadelphia was not unity. It was endurance, the ability to keep talking when no one agreed, to keep building when everything threatened to fall apart. The Constitution was not born from harmony. It was born from betrayal, and the fragile belief that even imperfect men could hold a nation together. There is a part of the Constitution that no one wanted to read aloud. Even as the ink dried in that sweltering Philadelphia hall, the delegates avoided the words, whispering them like a sickness they hoped no one would notice. It was written in careful language, clean, polite, deliberately vague, but everyone in that room knew what it meant. It was the clause that protected slavery, the compromise that chained a nation before it was even born. They didn't call it by name. They called it property, representation, commerce. In the official text, it spoke of persons held to service, and other persons, as if avoiding the word could erase the fact. But it was there the deal that counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a human being, balancing power between North and South with arithmetic instead of morality. Each stroke of the quill was a betrayal disguised as pragmatism. The Southern delegates came to Philadelphia armed not with muskets, but with threats. Without slavery, they said, there would be no union. Their wealth, their crops, their way of life depended on the bondage of others. The Northern delegates, uneasy but desperate for unity, gave in. The Revolution had promised liberty for all, but the Constitution settled for peace among the powerful. It was not a victory of justice, it was a truce with sin. Some protested. Gouverneur Morris called slavery a nefarious institution. Benjamin Franklin, too weary to fight another war of words, signed in silence. Madison recorded everything, his quill trembling on the page. They all knew what they had done and what they had failed to do. They had bound freedom to chains, declaring equality while institutionalizing its opposite. The new government was to stand on principles of liberty and on the backs of human beings. Outside the hall, the streets buzzed with celebration. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and printers rushed to publish the Constitution before the ink was dry. No one printed the shame. The words that ensured slavery's survival were buried in the fine print of history, hidden behind the language of law. America was already practicing its greatest contradiction to worship freedom while profiting from bondage. The compromise kept the Union intact, but it also planted a fuse. For decades, the clause sat in silence, its meaning ignored by those who found comfort in its vagueness. But silence cannot erase truth. The nation would one day tear itself apart, trying to reconcile what those men had refused to face. The Civil War did not begin at Fort Sumter. It began in that stifling room in Philadelphia, when they chose survival over justice. The Constitution was both miracle and mistake, a masterpiece built atop a moral fault line. Its framers gave the world democracy, but they gave it in chains. And for nearly a century, the country would live with that quiet, deadly contradiction, a republic born proclaiming liberty, with one clause whispering otherwise. They had won the war, but they were losing the peace. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry when the founders' men who had risked everything together turned their pens and passions against each other. The revolution had birthed a nation. Now it was tearing itself in half. On one side stood the Federalists, led by Hamilton and Adams, believers in strength, order, and a powerful central government. On the other stood the Anti-Federalists, rallied by Jefferson and Madison, defenders of liberty, states' rights, and suspicion of authority. And caught between them, wearing the weight of both sides like a crown of thorns, was George Washington. Washington had never wanted to be president. He saw the office not as a prize, but as a burden, a final duty in a life already heavy with them. He hoped to unite the factions, to be the quiet center of gravity in a storm of ambition. But unity proved to be the first casualty of the Republic. His cabinet, once a symbol of harmony, became a battleground. Hamilton and Jefferson clashed daily, their arguments echoing through the halls like cannon fire. Washington would listen in silence, face unreadable, until finally he would slam his hand on the table and end the debate with weary authority. Privately, he was in anguish. In letters to friends, he confessed that the government he had fought to create was already being poisoned by the spirit of party. He feared that partisanship would destroy the Republic faster than any foreign enemy. "The disorders of our own passions," he wrote, "are more formidable than the arms of our enemies." He had dreamed of a nation guided by reason and duty. Instead, he saw one driven by ego and fear. The Federalists believed that a strong government was essential to survival, that chaos was liberty's worst enemy. The Anti-Federalists believed the opposite, that concentrated power was tyranny reborn. Each side claimed to protect the revolution's legacy, and each accused the other of betraying it. Newspapers fanned the flames, turning disagreements into duels of ideology. Hamilton called Jefferson's vision anarchy in disguise. Jefferson called Hamilton's America monarchy with a new name. The founders, who had once signed the same documents, now treated each other as threats to the very freedom they had created. Washington tried to rise above it, but even he could not stay untouched. He was accused of favoring one side, of betraying Republican simplicity, of becoming the very thing he had once resisted a ruler. The attacks wounded him deeply. When he stepped down after 2 terms, he did so not in triumph, but in quiet disappointment. In his farewell address, he pleaded with the nation to shun faction and remember that unity was its only armor. Few listened. The Republic had survived its birth, but now it faced its adolescence angry, divided, and loud. The founders, who had dreamed together of liberty, had discovered that freedom itself could be the seed of conflict. Washington's greatest fear had come true before he died. The enemy was no longer across the ocean. It was within the house they had built together. It began as a debate, but it ended as a defining split, 2 visions of America colliding under the same flag. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were supposed to be allies, bound by revolution and duty. Instead, they became the architects of opposition, shaping a conflict that would echo for centuries. Their war was not fought with bullets, but with words, letters, and legislation, a duel of philosophies that carved the nation's soul in two. Hamilton saw America as a machine waiting to be built, a country of factories, ports, and ledgers. He believed in structure, in credit, in cities that hummed with energy and ambition. To him, power wasn't dangerous, chaos was. The nation needed banks, debt, and discipline to bind it together. Order was the price of survival, and Hamilton was willing to pay it. He wanted a strong central government that could stand toe-to-toe with the great empires of the world. To his mind, freedom meant stability, not sentiment. Jefferson saw the same land and imagined something entirely different. He dreamed of a republic of farmers, independent, self-reliant, virtuous in their simplicity. He believed cities were corrupting, banks enslaving, and ambition a kind of moral decay. True liberty, he said, was found in the soil, in the sweat of honest labor. He feared that Hamilton's America, industrial, financial, urban, would become the very tyranny they had fought to escape, ruled not by kings but by creditors. Their battle played out in the cabinet, in Congress, and in the newspapers that became their chosen weapons. Hamilton's Federalists wrote of progress and prestige. Jefferson's Republicans wrote of purity and preservation. Every policy became a proxy war. A national bank wasn't just a financial proposal, it was a test of faith. The whiskey tax wasn't about revenue, it was about who the new government truly served. To Hamilton, dissent was dangerous. To Jefferson, obedience was worse. Washington tried to keep peace between them, but even he could feel the country splitting beneath their words. The arguments that filled those candlelit rooms about money, power, and morality were more than politics. They were prophecies. Hamilton's vision would lead to skyscrapers, Wall Street, and the modern economy. Jefferson's would live on, in the myth of the frontier, the small town, the dream of individual freedom. Both men were right and both were wrong. By the time one was dead and the other retired to Monticello, their ideas had already hardened into America's two great instincts: to build upward or to look backward, to centralize or to disperse, to dream of empire or of independence. Their feud became the blueprint for every political battle to come. The United States would never truly choose between Hamilton and Jefferson, because it was born from both. Aaron Burr was everything a founder was supposed to be: brilliant, brave, and ambitious to the edge of danger. He had fought in the Revolution, stood beside Washington, and risen to the nation's highest offices. But to his peers, there was something unsettling about him, a calm too measured, a charm too perfect. Where Hamilton blazed with conviction, Burr glided with calculation. He didn't fight for ideals, he fought for victory. In a republic built on principle that made him a threat. He and Hamilton were once allies, bound by war and politics. But ambition has a way of turning comrades into rivals. Burr moved like a shadow through early American politics, manipulating alliances, bending loyalty into opportunity. When he ran for president in 1800, he tied Jefferson in the Electoral College, sending the young republic into chaos. The House chose Jefferson, but the tie left a scar. Hamilton, fearing Burr's hunger for power, turned his influence against him. From that moment, their fates were intertwined like flint and steel. The two men loathed each other in public and in print. Hamilton called Burr a dangerous man, unfit to be trusted with the reins of government. Burr answered not with words, but with a challenge. In July of 1804, at dawn on the misty banks of the Hudson River, they met two of the most powerful men in America, standing 10 paces apart, pistols in hand. The air was still. The duel was illegal, but in that strange code of honor that governed their generation, it was also inevitable. Witnesses said Hamilton seemed uneasy that morning, almost reluctant. He claimed he would not fire at Burr, that he would throw away his shot. Burr, ever the pragmatist, had no such hesitation. At the count, 2 shots cracked through the fog. Hamilton fell, struck in the abdomen, his pistol discharged harmlessly into the air. Burr stood motionless, smoke curling around him. Within hours, Hamilton was dying, whispering prayers in a friend's house across the river. Burr, suddenly the most infamous man in America, mounted his horse and rode into history's shadows. The duel destroyed him. He was charged with murder in 2 states, abandoned by allies, and hunted by his own reputation. His name became Poison, the first great American villain, condemned not for treason, but for pride. Yet, even in disgrace, Burr refused to vanish. He went west, scheming to carve his own empire, whispering to adventurers and mercenaries of new nations that would bear his name. It failed, of course, as all empires built on ego do. He lived long enough to see his enemies turned to marble and his own story reduced to a footnote. Once, he had stood at the center of power. Now, he was a ghost wandering through the margins of history. But the tragedy of Aaron Burr wasn't just that he killed a man. It was that he killed the version of America where a man like him could have belonged. In their final years, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams became pen pals in the shadow of their own legacy. Once brothers in revolution, then enemies in politics, they had not spoken for over a decade. Pride had turned friendship to frost. But age has a way of melting old wounds, and in the winter of 1812, a letter crossed the mountains from Monticello to Quincy. Jefferson's handwriting was shaky but familiar. Adams opened it, smiled faintly, and the silence of 10 years broke like thawing ice. What began as a polite exchange soon became a torrent. Over 14 years, they wrote more than 100 letters, a conversation that spanned philosophy, memory, and mortality. Gone were the speeches and slogans. What remained were two old men trying to understand what they had done. They spoke of the revolution like survivors of a shipwreck, wondering how the same wind that once filled their sails had scattered their ideals across the world. "We have done more than we meant," Adams wrote. "We have founded a power which seems to want only a name." Jefferson, the dreamer still, wrote of liberty as if it were a living thing, wounded but not dead. Yet he admitted his fear that the republic they'd built was already mutating into something else. "The boisterous sea of liberty is never without a wave," he said, though privately he feared the tide had turned against them. He watched cities rise, banks grow, and politics harden into factions that looked more like Hamilton's vision than his own. His revolution of farmers was turning into an empire of clerks. Adams, ever the realist, took a darker view. He worried less about kings and more about the people. "Democracy never lasts long," he warned. "It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself." To him, the experiment had succeeded too well, unleashing passions that no parchment could contain. Yet beneath the cynicism was affection for the nation they had midwifed, a reluctant pride in its survival. He told Jefferson that despite everything, the feuds, the failures, the betrayals, he would not have changed the fight. The two men found comfort in their shared mortality. They spoke of grandchildren, of books unread, of the ache of memory. Their words softened with age, the anger replaced by admiration. Jefferson once wrote, "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other." By the time the letters stopped, they had. They forgave each other, not in a single grand gesture, but in the slow, honest rhythm of conversation. On July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the declaration they had signed together, Adams lay dying in Massachusetts. His last words were, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." But in Monticello, Jefferson had passed just hours earlier. Two lives, two philosophies, two halves of a single legacy ending on the same day, as if history itself wanted to close the circle. Their letters were never meant for the public, yet they became America's most human monument, proof that even the founders who shaped the world with conviction could only make peace with it through forgiveness. The founding fathers had written their dream in ink, but their descendants began rewriting it in blood and ambition. By the early 19th century, America had outgrown its infancy, restless, confident, and already bending its founding ideals into new shapes. The words liberty and manifest destiny rolled easily off politicians' tongues, but their meanings were no longer the same. The generation that followed Jefferson and Adams didn't inherit their doubts, only their language, and with it, they built a new empire from the contradictions the founders had left behind. The Constitution had been born out of compromise, and now that compromise was coming due. The same document that promised equality was being used to defend inequality. The same rhetoric of freedom justified conquest. In the halls of Congress, men quoted Jefferson while voting to expand slavery westward. On the frontier, settlers carried muskets in one hand and the Declaration in the other, claiming divine sanction for the land they took. The Revolution's poetry had become policy and its ideals, weapons. The next generation spoke of liberty as destiny, not duty. Expansion became a holy mission not to free others, but to control them. The Louisiana Purchase, once Jefferson's pragmatic gamble, became the blueprint for continental hunger. America was growing in land, in power, and in self-deception. Politicians invoked the founders like scripture, twisting their words to sanctify what they could not have defended in person. Even slavery, that unhealed wound written into the Constitution's silences, found new champions who claimed to speak in the founders' name. They argued that liberty required order, that property included people, that the republic itself depended on hierarchy. It was the perfect inversion, the language of freedom turned into the grammar of oppression. The men who had written "all men are created equal" had left just enough ambiguity for others to decide who counted as men. Some saw it happening and recoiled. Frederick Douglass would later ask, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" The question that split the country's conscience in two. Others, like Andrew Jackson, saw opportunity and seized it, using Jefferson's ideals of self-governance to justify removal, conquest, and control. The Founders' Republic was being remade into something larger and harder, a nation that preached liberty but practiced dominion. The Founding Fathers had imagined a fragile experiment, a republic that might fail if its citizens forgot humility. But their heirs believed in destiny, not fragility. They inherited power without the doubt that once restrained it. And so, as the century turned, the dream of liberty the founders had kindled began to burn hotter, brighter, and far less pure. The men who had feared kings had accidentally built a kingdom in waiting, and the generation that followed, armed with their words, claimed the crown they had tried so hard to refuse. Time has a way of sanding away the edges of men until all that remains are shapes we can worship. The Founding Fathers, once fragile and furious and full of contradictions, became marble. They were recast in textbooks as visionaries untouched by doubt, men who spoke in thunder and saw in prophecy. But that was never who they were. They were flawed, frightened, brilliant, and sometimes wrong. And yet, we chose to remember them as saints, because saints are easier to admire than humans are to understand. The young republic needed heroes. It needed certainty. So history did what nations always do when they grow too large for memory, it simplified. Washington became courage without hesitation. Jefferson became wisdom without hypocrisy. Franklin became genius without deceit. Hamilton became ambition without arrogance. Their complexities were erased, their sins softened, their humanity lost in the light of their own legend. The country they built out of doubt now demanded faith. In schools and monuments, their flaws were edited away. The same Jefferson who wrote about equality but owned slaves became the prophet of liberty. The same Adams who defended freedom of speech but jailed critics under the Sedition Act became the voice of moral principle. Their contradictions were not lies, they were warnings. But warnings don't inspire nations. Myths do. Every generation that followed built its own version of the founders. To some, they were proof that America was chosen by Providence. To others, they were hypocrites to be torn down. Both sides missed the point. The truth was always in between, that greatness and guilt can live in the same heart, that progress is born from imperfection, and that the Republic's strength lies not in perfection, but in its ability to argue with itself. When we turned the men into monuments, we froze the story. Statues don't think, and myths don't change. The same minds that once dared to question kings became untouchable relics, and the questions they wanted us to keep asking turned to silence. We built temples to their memory instead of continuing their work. The nation that began in rebellion ended up venerating its own founders as if they were gods, the very thing they feared most. The cost of worship is forgetfulness. In polishing their image, we lost their struggle, the sleepless nights, the doubt, the fierce arguments that made the idea of America possible in the first place. They didn't give us perfection. They gave us permission to question. And when we trade truth for legend, we betray the very experiment they risked everything to begin. The Founding Fathers were never meant to be idols. They were meant to be examples not of purity, but of courage in imperfection. What we lost wasn't their glory, it was their humanity. More than 2 centuries later, their shadows still stretch across every debate, every courthouse, every classroom. The Founding Fathers built a nation that was never finished a system designed to argue with itself. They knew that power, once claimed, must always be questioned. They built checks not only against kings and tyrants, but against the darker instincts in all of us. Their brilliance wasn't in pretending to have answers. It was in giving a nation the tools to keep asking. Their flaws were not footnotes, they were lessons. Washington showed the strength of restraint. Jefferson proved that ideas can outlive their contradictions. Hamilton taught that ambition can build as much as it destroys. Adams and Abigail reminded us that reason must have conscience. Franklin, ever the pragmatist, showed that truth and compromise are not enemies. They were imperfect teachers, but they understood something that even we struggle with now. Democracy isn't a faith, it's a habit, one that must be practiced, protected, and repaired. The republic they left us was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be tested. They expected every generation to rewrite the definition of freedom, to confront the hypocrisies they themselves left behind. And though we often fail them, the fact that we can fail openly, loudly, and without fear of kings is itself their greatest gift. The revolution didn't end at Yorktown or Philadelphia. It continues every time a citizen speaks, protests, votes, or questions. Still, their legacy remains a paradox. They wrote liberty into law while living in chains of their own making. They spoke of unity while sowing division. They declared equality while denying it to most. And yet, in those contradictions lies the soul of the American experiment, the belief that truth can evolve, that justice can expand, that we can become better than the world that made us. They could not imagine our world, its machines, its movements, its millions. But they would recognize the same struggle in its heart: fear versus hope, cynicism versus courage, selfishness versus sacrifice. The Republic endures not because it is perfect, but because it is unfinished. Its strength has always come from the friction between what we are and what we claim to be. They were flawed men, but they gave us a framework strong enough to hold both failure and redemption. Their contradictions became our compass. Their doubts became our inheritance. The documents they left behind were not commandments, they were challenges. They didn't give us perfection. They gave us a question, and we're still answering it.